Picture this, you're at a store, and suddenly, everything from cars to clothes to electronics costs noticeably more. You might ask why, and one word keeps popping up in the news to explain it, and that's tariffs. In February 2025, US President Donald Trump began rolling out new tariffs on imports once again. Not just on China, which, let's be honest, wasn't exactly a shocker, but also on Mexico and even on close US allies like Canada, Japan, and South Korea. So what's actually going on here? You've probably heard the word tariff thrown around 100 times, but do you really know what it means? What exactly is a tariff, and how does it work? Do tariffs actually do what they're supposed to do? And most importantly, how will they affect you and your daily life? In this video, we are breaking down everything you need to know about tariffs. So let's get into it. A tariff is simply a tax that a government places on products coming in from other countries. Sounds a bit strange, right? Why would they even do that? Let's break it down with an example. Say the US can produce its own bread and sell it for $3. Meanwhile, China managed to produce and sell that exact same bread, similar quality, and all just for $1. Naturally, most Americans would prefer this cheaper Chinese bread, since it's basically the same product at a lower price. But this creates a real problem for the US bakeries, since they simply can't compete with that price. So to protect and support US businesses, the government steps in and places a tariff on Chinese bread. Let's say that tariff is $3. Now, when that $1 Chinese bread enters the US market, it gets hit with an extra $3 tax, pushing its price up to $4. Meanwhile, US bread stays at $3, meaning the Chinese bread is now actually more expensive. As a result, most Americans end up choosing the cheaper, local option instead. So simply put, governments use tariffs to make foreign products more expensive than local ones. That way, local products become more attractive, budget-friendly choice for the local buyers. Now that you understand what a tariff is, let's move on to the next section. After understanding tariffs, you might still be confused about whether they are good or bad, because it seems like the answer sits somewhere in the middle. Well, the truth is, it depends. Tariffs don't have a clear-cut outcome, since their impact really depends and varies based on the situation. But first, let's talk about some of the advantages of tariffs. The first advantage is protecting local businesses. Without tariffs, cheap imports can flood the market and crush local industries. Take Harley-Davidson for example, which once held 100% of the heavy motorcycle market, only to see its share collapse to 15% as Japanese brands like Honda and Yamaha took over with cheaper bikes. In 1983, the US government stepped in with a 45% tariff on imported heavy motorcycles, giving Harley-Davidson time to restructure. By 1987, the company had recovered so well that it actually asked the tariffs to be removed. The second advantage is increased government revenue. Tariffs basically function as an extra tax, and every imported product hit with one sends money straight to the government, which can in theory fund infrastructure or public services. The third advantage is protecting national interest. Tariffs are often used as leverage. The US has pressured Mexico with tariffs to push for stricter immigration controls and holding them until demands are met. Tariffs are also used to push domestic companies to move production home, although this often backfires, as companies simply relocate to other low-cost countries like Vietnam instead, to avoid the tariffs. Now let's talk about the disadvantages. The first disadvantage is the higher costs for consumers. Say a Mexican bakery spends $1 to make bread and sells it for $2. If the US slaps a $2 tariff on it, the bakery raises its price to $4 to protect its profit, and the American consumer ends up footing that bill. The second disadvantage is that it hurts the local businesses relying on imports. Now, an American sandwich shop trying to buy that now pricier Mexican bread can either raise its own prices, risking customers to go away, or absorb that loss. The third disadvantage is the damaged international relations. When one country imposes tariffs, the other often retaliates with tariffs of its own, known as reciprocal tariffs. If both sides keep escalating, it can spiral into a full-blown trade war, straining trust and cooperation between nations. So now that you understand both sides, you might be wondering, do tariffs actually work? That's exactly what we'll explore next. Well, the answer is that sometimes they work, but most of the time they don't work as intended. Let's use a simple example to see how this plays out. Say there are two countries named Country A and Country B. Country A was famous for its chocolate chip cookies, while Country B made the best pies in the world. People in each country loved the other's specialty, and they traded happily. One day, however, Country A's local pie makers complained they couldn't compete with Country B's cheaper and better pies, so the government placed the tariffs on the imported pies, making them pricier and pushing people towards the local ones. At first, it worked. More people bought the local pies, while loyal Country B fans paid more. Local pies thrived, but with no real competition left, some got lazy and stopped improving. The cafes relying on Country B's pies for desserts also struggled, which forces them to raise prices to cover for the price of tariffs or settle for the lower quality local pies. Country B, watching its exports drop, retaliated with its own tariffs on Country A's cookies. And suddenly, the cookie business in Country A lost its sales in Country B, and bakeries in Country B using Country A's cookies faced the same squeeze, which forced it to raise prices or downgrade its quality, which lose customers either way. If both sides kept piling on tariffs, a full-blown trade war would break out. Businesses relying on imports faced higher costs, and exporters would lose foreign customers. And price climbed while options shrank as well. Without competition, quality on both sides starts slipping too. So tariffs might sound like a smart fix at first, but they often backfire, hurting businesses, consumers, and innovation, usually leaving everyone worse off in the end. Now, let's step away from the story and look at some real-world examples. Now, tariffs might sound like a pretty bad idea at this point, so why do governments still consider them? Well, even though many tariffs fail, some actually work. A real-life example of a successful tariff is South Korea's strategy to protect its automobile industry back in the 1960s and 1970s. Local companies like Hyundai and Kia were struggling against established foreign brands, so South Korea imposed high tariffs on imported cars to give its own industry room to grow. But instead of becoming complacent, these tariffs actually pushed local companies to innovate and improve their technology. South Korea's smart diplomacy also helped it to avoid retaliation, and it got a bit lucky too, since the Korean car market was still small at that time. Major car exporting countries didn't see it as a serious threat yet. This combination of genuine innovation and careful diplomacy is what allowed South Korea's tariffs to succeed, which eventually enabled Hyundai and Kia to compete successfully on the global stage. On the other hand, a clear example of tariffs backfiring is the US and China trade war, which began in 2018, during Donald Trump's first term. He noticed the US was importing far more from China than he was exporting, which created a massive trade deficit. In response, he imposed tariffs on Chinese imports to try and shrink that gap. But China retaliated with its own tariffs on US exports, particularly on agricultural products. This hurt Chinese companies by making their exports to the US more expensive, affecting around $350 billion worth of goods between 2018 and 2020. At the same time, US consumers who relied on Chinese imports ended up paying higher prices too. Meanwhile, US farmers took a serious hit as China imposed reciprocal tariffs on agricultural products. According to Moody's analysis, the trade war ultimately led to an estimated loss of 300,000 jobs and shaved 0.3% off the real GDP. So who actually won this trade war? Surprisingly, the answer is Vietnam, as companies rushed to move production out of China to dodge the tariffs. Many relocated the factories to Vietnam instead, significantly boosting its exports to the US. In the end, both the US and China lost significant amounts of money, while Vietnam ended up gaining a windfall it never even asked for. So in conclusion, tariffs can be useful in some cases, helping local industries grow, increasing government revenue, and protecting national interests. But they can also lead to higher cost, higher prices and trade disputes, and unintended economic consequences. So governments have to use tariffs wisely, making sure they end up helping the economy rather than harming it.